Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I see that we have a lot of people on the call. Let me see. Yes, quite a few of you are here. And thank you for being there on time. And I apologize for the slight delay. I had a bit of a technical difficulty, and now we are good to go. Right. So today's call, it has two objectives. One is to have a general capacity building session on what NDCs are and then how the review process could work at national level. And then also to engage with our partners from Humane Society International, and then see what we can do at country level in a collaborative manner. I'm Vositha Wijenayake. I wear two hats at the moment for the purpose of this call. I'm the Executive Director of SLYCAN Trust and Country Director for Humane Society International in Sri Lanka. And I'll give the introduction on what NDCs are and how Ndc Cycle works and how our work could connect to it. So let me just get the presentation. Right. Dennis, I think I need a bit of help to get just the presentation visible, if you could make that happen. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to start, and I'm hoping that the side box is not going to block the view. And in the meantime, if Dennis can fix the view option just to have the presentation, that'll be great. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about nationally determined contributions, and it's under the Paris Agreement. And how, just to get a basic idea, how many of you are aware of the Paris Agreement? How many of you have heard of the Paris Agreement? If you have heard, just say yes, and I'll see how many people quickly say yes. Okay, so a lot of people know what the Paris Agreement is. I'm not going to go into in detail analysis of what the Paris Agreement and climate change is. I'm going to assume that the basic understanding is, okay, this is climate change. Climate change happens due to anthropological actions of human beings where we are emitting carbon and other GHG emissions. And the background is that in 1992, we had the UNFCCC that was set up to address climate change impacts. And then in the primary stages, we focused on mitigation because we thought we have to cut emissions. But then around 2000, early 2000, it was realized that just mitigation is not enough. There needs to be adaptation and priority sector as well. So we have priorities given to adaptation and mitigation now. And since about 2012, or like around that time, loss and damage was another thing that was discussed, where adaptation is also not enough anymore. We cannot adapt to everything that we feel because we're already feeling losses and damages. And under the Paris Agreement, we have the loss and damage component also identified and addressed. So the discussions around climate change now has mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And around it also means of implementation. So the presentation would have these elements, which is NDCs in the Paris Agreement. So NDCs stand for National Determined Contributions. And then Ndc Cycle, how we will be updating it, when the submissions need to happen, and what are the key moments that are quite close to us at the moment. Then the submissions that are called for in 2020. And then how the country level actions could happen around NDCs, because nationally determined contributions focus on targets that are national, and then which contributes to the global process. And then how we can align other processes, for example, Sustainable Development Goals, Sendai Framework, and other processes that are national level and global, to the processes which relate to NDCs. So starting with NDCs in the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement had its objectives to have collective goals. So that is to say, the global goal for a temperature increase that we want to maintain is seen as a global level one. So it's to keep it well below 2 degrees and within 1.5 degrees. And that is for the global range. But then at country levels, this could be different. So to achieve this global target, the countries were requested to act as a group in submitting intended nationally determined contributions. Before the Paris Agreement was ratified, the countries were requested to provide mitigation targets or other commitments that they would like to put forward as something voluntarily. So as something voluntary rather. So it's a collective effort to have a global emission trajectory, which has these objectives achieved to not go beyond the 2 degrees mark. And then to achieve it, we have individual countries contributing. So when we were talking about the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, initially the objectives were stringent on the developed countries, like the objectives were there, but the commitments were for the countries that were developed countries to cut down their emissions. But with the Paris Agreement, it became something which is global, where the developing countries were also submitting, this is the amount of commitment we are making at the emission cut, as well as adaptation and loss and damage actions. So what are the NDCs? So the Paris Agreement has guiding principles that aim to achieve the highest possible ambition level. That means to reduce the highest amount of emissions at country level so that we have a global stocktake which provides the highest potential for climate emission reduction. And these are supposed to be economy-wide ones, which means it applies to all economic sectors. And these are also for developed and developing countries. And they become commitments which are binding once the ratifications are made on primarily the developed countries based on the areas that relate to it. So for example, climate finance, mitigation targets and all, they become binding if you've submitted it and we ratified the NDC, if you ratify the Paris Agreement, so which is ratified since 2016. And if you look at the NDCs, we had INDCs around 193, which were submitted. Right now, there's, I think, about 180 NDCs that have been ratified. So when the ratification of the Paris Agreement happened in 2016, which was like faster than a lot of countries expected for it to happen, the INDCs that were submitted by countries prior to the Paris Agreement, the COP in 2015, became nationally determined contributions. So they became binding on the countries to act on. Why do I have the same thing twice? Okay. But yeah, so in countries like Sri Lanka and some other countries, small island developing countries, some LDCs, in addition to adaptation, there's also loss and damage, which I mentioned as commitment. So if you look at the Sri Lankan loss and damage NDCs, there are things like setting up a national mechanism to cover all areas that relate to the Verso International Mechanism, which is under the UNFCCC process, which covers things like disasters, non-economic losses, biodiversity loss, and then insurance risk transfer mechanisms that could address climate impacts. So if you look at the Sri Lankan one, that's there. But in some countries, it's not explicitly stated. It could be under certain elements of sectors. Say if you have, this is just an example. So if you have the farm animals, like which we would title under agricultural livestock sector in the NDCs, losses of animals during droughts, which is a cost and an expense on the part of farmers, would come under loss and damage. So in the discussions we've been having in Sri Lanka on review process of the NDCs, these have been highlighted so that it doesn't reflect only as a component of loss and damage, but it could be a cross-cutting element, loss and damage, under each sector. Okay, so next slide. So if we look at certain information that could go under the NDCs, so national circumstances. So if you look at the Indian NDCs, there's a big component on national circumstances, explaining what the country's status is, what the policies are. And this is the same for Sri Lankan one. Almost all the countries have this included. Then mitigation actions, because NDCs are, at least NDCs were expected to be primarily on mitigation to have the global emission targets set. So every country would put a mitigation component into the NDCs. And then adaptation actions. All developing countries have this, almost all of them. I can't think of one that doesn't. So there'll be like co-benefits based or like adaptation specific sectors, including NDCs. And then economic indicators could be also incorporated. So when we did the INDCs in 2015, it was in many countries a rush process. It was something very new to developing countries, especially developing countries that lacked capacities and technical expertise on it. And then there wasn't a lot of information available, for example, to understand the risks of climate change. And then certain vulnerabilities were not evidence-based that we incorporate into the NDCs. So economic calculations, economic scenarios, these would be things that are important to think of when we are developing our targets. And then in 2020, there's a better understanding of these than in 2015. So climate vulnerabilities, we talked about climate vulnerabilities in 2015 with IPCC AR5 report. We are talking about climate risks. And then most of the national communications that countries are doing at the moment focus on or try to focus on climate risks when they're developing actions. So vulnerabilities, risks, those could be important elements, and then hazards that are key hazards that need to be taken into consideration. Then opportunities for cooperation. So NDCs are expected to be participatory, inclusive, multi-actor processes, while it's up to the country to make the targets and commit to them. So in the implementation process, having cooperation and partnerships which are national as well as international is important. And this is something we need to take into consideration, especially when we are updating or reviewing the process. So it could be a better process than what it was in 2015. Support and costs. So the problem with a lot of NDCs or any policy that is out there is we have papers drafted ideally with all these indicators and vulnerabilities and evidence-based actions developed. But then when we are going to implement them, if we do not have finance or climate finance or development finance to do these things, it becomes an issue. So identifying the calculations for each action, for implementation, monitoring and evaluation, all this would be very important. For example, you have two types of targets within NDCs. One which is unconditional and the other one which is conditional. And then the countries would have two levels of emission reduction targets. If it's conditional, that means it could be higher because you are dependent on regional and international bilateral funding to implement these activities. And then if it's unconditional, that's usually the country having the capacity to do it on their own. So the Sri Lankan one has this, I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's 4% unconditional and 20 or 16 conditional. Every country has this. So the idea is that country commits on its own to do something. And then if we have technology transfer, means of implementation, capacity building, and other processes that link to it, where the targets could be higher. Oops. What happened? Right. So for a moment, I think I just disappeared for some reason. I'm not too sure. Okay, so now it's the NDC cycle. And then the first part of the NDC started in 2014-15 before the Paris Agreement came into being. And then we had a global stocktake in 2018. And then there's also the 2020 review update. So if you take, these are there's a few information that's available on NDC. So the Paris Agreement in the objectives talk about the mitigation ambition and the progression to be made. And then the mandatory cycles of NDCs, which are supposed to be every 5 years. And most countries had the NDC target year for 2020. So the 5-year cycles for review and update is thought of as 2020, 2025, 2030, but then there's also the stock takes happening, so 2018 and 2023. So facilitative dialogue, global stock take, which I refer to as taking into account what's the status, if these are the mitigation targets, what needs to be improved, where are we heading in the trajectory of increase of temperature, the finance needed to ensure that these actions are taken. And then the transparency framework. So with the Paris rule book that was adopted, implementation elements were identified, which includes transparency, accountability, which relate to monitoring and evaluation of actions. So it's not just about implementation, but there's the aspect of means of implementation and also the accountability and transparency that play a key role. So how would the NDCs act? So you have, as I mentioned, there are different countries that develop their NDCs. And then we have a general country-based economy-wide target that countries set for themselves. And in the end, the objective is that it links to the Paris Agreement's objective, which is 2 degrees, maintaining the increase of temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius and within 1.5. And why are these two there? Because there were different negotiation blocks that wanted these numbers inserted, and some felt that it's difficult to achieve 1.5. So we have 1.5, but with the limit being 2 degrees. And so how a country could contribute is by having increased ambition. And yes, you would have a question about how the smaller countries could not have the same impact when it comes to emission targets, which is true. So we need to have the larger countries committing to ambitious emission targets if we want to achieve these goals. So 2020 is the year for NDC update or review, depending on which category the country falls under. And why are these done? So as I mentioned, NDCs, when they were initially developed, they were considered a document that the countries were submitting. And there was the possibility that countries could update this, but a lot of countries did not update the NDCs between the point of December 2015 to November 2016. So what they have is the INDC they submitted, which converted to NDC when the Paris Agreement was ratified. And now we have the opportunity to understand what the country level is, what are the potential long-term trajectory development plans of the countries would be, additional evidence and information on climate scenarios at country level, climate risks, development priorities, economic needs could be taken into consideration. So based on these, there's the possibility for countries to upgrade the NDCs. So for example, if in Sri Lanka, we thought our target for, I don't know, for example, the reduction was possible for increase of renewable energy was 2% that has been submitted. This is a hypothetical one. If it's 2% that we thought it was possible unconditionally, and now if we know that with the capacities we've developed and the technology available, we could go up to 10%. So in 2020, we could commit to something which is 10%. But in country level, most of the time what happens is if the capacity is 25%, we would have a global policy that is like the commitment that we give to the global, global community as something below that level. Because if we cannot perform what we have committed, it becomes a problem as well. So you would see something in the national level much higher in terms of potential and national policy, which is more ambitious than the NDC, but it doesn't mean that you should put a level that is way below the actual reality. So this opportunity in 2020 is for us to update these realities and include them into the NDCs that are being submitted. And then in 2015, we also had other processes like Sustainable Development Goals, Sendai Framework, and they also have common target years 2030. So without duplicating these processes, on how these could be integrated and taken together in terms of implementing actions. Because some of these targets are relevant, like say climate action is part of the SDGs, and there are also other things like energy, gender, partnerships, all that relates to climate change and NDCs. So how can these be together? And then Sendai framework focuses on disasters and how can disasters and loss and damage actions under NDCs or climate action link up. So there are a lot of commonalities that could be taken into consideration, and when we update or submit new NDCs, reflect a common target or a common objective for the country, rather than having multiple processes with multiple finance being utilized to achieve different targets. So in-country activities, so for example, in Sri Lanka, since 2018, towards the end of 2018, we've started the NDC review process. And this is linked to INDC readiness targets, because Sri Lanka expected to start implementing NDCs by 2020. And they developed another document that's called the INDC Readiness Plan, which I identified for each sector, the line ministries, the departments, their activities to be done to be able to implement the NDC. So since 2018, the review process of these activities have started. And in 2019, with our support, so SLYCAN Trust was also supporting these actions. The review process for adaptation sector NDCs were initiated. So there were about 15, 20 consultations that were conducted to ensure that multiple stakeholders could engage to identify the gaps that are there to implement NDCs, what actions need to be taken. So now this is now expanded, and they've also enhanced the process of review, and they want to have more consultations happening so that different groups of stakeholders could engage in active manner. And the expectation is that well, at least it used to be, the expectation was that in 2020, by June, we would be able to have the draft reviewed NDCs, which seems unlikely given the circumstances, but hopefully we will be able to have these processes in place once we are out of our houses and curfew is lifted and people can engage more. So for us, what's important is how can civil society, youth, academia, and scientists and everybody else engage in this process, so that the NDC submitted this time are not going to be in isolation, but are going to be things that reflect the realities on the ground and the issues that are already faced by communities and vulnerable ecosystems. And then it's also important that we align the global and national processes. So it cannot be something which is outside, that we speak to the global community, and not something that we do not implement at national level. And also saying something to the global community that we cannot implement or which is not a priority for the country also doesn't make sense. So identifying these things and aligning them and engaging the community, the multi-stakeholder groups, civil society organizations to engage and contribute to this is also important. So just to understand a couple of entry points for us to engage in the NDC process, I'll just show you a chart which was developed for a different process, which is a national adaptation planning process, which is also integrated into the NDCs, because NDC funding is for mitigation. So the mitigation sector actions are usually considered as climate finance for NDCs. And the idea is that adaptation sectors would have funding through National Adaptation Plan process or something similar to that. So that's the readiness planning funding that comes from the Green Climate Fund, which is expected to help out with the sectors that relate to the National Adaptation Plan. So it's important to know that also when we're talking about NDCs, like if you just look at a process of how we can develop the NDCs, this could be applied to the NDC process also. We need to identify the climate risks and vulnerabilities, because that would be the evidence to which we need to take action. And then we would need to identify the development priorities as well for the country without having isolated actions for emission reductions. So it's important to identify these, because developing countries have the right to development as well, and that needs to be taken into account. And then Sendai framework and sustainable development goals could be integrated into the NDC process. And then other aspects like gender responsive actions and social and economic resilience could also be taken into account. I mean, not could, but they need to be taken into account. And then adaptation actions, if you're talking about adaptation sector, because this was initially for the NAP process that this was developed, this template, but it could apply to the NDCs as well. So we need to know the scope, what are the priority sectors for the country, how feasible are these? Can we do this with technology that's in country, or do we need technology transfer these actions? And then stakeholders to engage, what are their roles, how can they contribute? For example, do we have co-benefits between mitigation and adaptation actions? If you take the agriculture sector, we could have mitigation targets as well as adaptation actions that are included. So these are some of the stuff that we can take into consideration, and this could apply to mitigation sector, adaptation sector, loss and damage, all three of them, in developing the actions and the process to go forward with it. So this is just an overview. I hope people understood what I was trying to say. I'll be very happy to clarify anything and maybe look into certain documents to give some clarifications if needed also. I'll stop here for the moment and hopefully open the floor for your comments or questions. You could type your comments and questions on the chat box so that everybody can see it on the screen without having any technical difficulties to hear you. So if you have any questions, please type your questions. Okay, what is the consequence of not developing or reviewing the NDCs and of non-implementation? Okay, so under the Paris Agreement, it's a facilitation of compliance that's there. So for example, if a country doesn't do what's required of them, the compliance component would be to see what's going on, what is the problem, see what needs are there, technological capacity-based needs to do these actions, and then encourage and facilitate the process for implementation. So if this is about India, that if it's like a country-specific question, what we need to check is whether they have a 2025 target or 2030 target. And if it's 2025, they do need to submit it. 2031, they request for a review, not a new submission. So those things will also need to be checked when we are looking at whether a country must, and if they're not doing, how to do it, how will they be addressed. But if you're talking about the compliance regime under the Paris Agreement, then it's a facilitative process. So if the targets are not met, if the actions are not taken, then they'll be facilitated to take them. It's not like the Kyoto Protocol. Okay. Okay, right. Yeah, almost all actually, except for Nicaragua, and there was one more. I'm not entirely sure, but at one point, there were two countries that were not with NDCs. One was Nicaragua. Iran did submit, so I need to double check whether right now all the countries have. And then what happens if a country doesn't submit in time or falls behind? So that's again the facilitation process. The downside, if a country doesn't do these voluntary actions, which they've committed to, then we cannot have actual global targets, because there'll be adaptation goals and mitigation goals that are set, and we would know the trajectory in which the temperature increase is happening. And if countries decide not to do this, then it becomes a problem because the numbers are not going to be accurate. But in terms of compliance, then the countries would be contacted, and then the regime would check why they cannot do this. Is it because they don't have finance, because they don't have technical capacity? If that's the case, how can they implement it with the help? But usually the process is that the country needs to reach out requesting for support, which was what most countries wanted to have, not like a tribunal kind of situation, but contacting the compliance committee, reaching out and asking for help, and then getting help to submit it. Okay, so based on how the Paris Agreement is, NDCs are binding to the point that the country has voluntarily taken this as an action. But NDCs alone are not binding. So it's more of a thing that we have committed internationally, so that it's up to us to do this. But NDCs on its own are not considered as binding. The text of the Paris Agreement, it's binding, but NDCs are used as an attachment because the countries have submitted their own, and there's the flexibility for the countries to upgrade this. But in the text, it says if you have submitted an INDC, that when you do any changes, that cannot be a backtracking one. So the ambition level cannot be decreased, it has to be increased. But NDCs themselves are not taken as binding targets because it gives the flexibility for the country to renew it. Okay, so there's a lot of literature out there. So for example, some of the slides I've used, they're from the UNFCCC's presentations themselves, because I didn't see the point of recreating the same slide. So you'll have a lot of material on the UNFCCC website. The problem with the UNFCCC website is it can be a bit, what's the best word to use this? It has a lot of content, but it can make you get lost in their system because it's not so well structured in terms of search and all. But if you type UNFCCC NDCs, you will be led to the general overview of things, and then all the processes under the UNFCCC from the 1992 process to the Paris Agreement, and all the NDCs of countries, ratification updates, all those will be there. And for simpler ones, there are a couple of policy briefs that we developed also, which we could share on how integration of NDCs could happen, how risk assessments could be included in NDCs, that sort of stuff. But I think the starting point would be the UNFCCC website if you want to just have a general overview of the process. And if you want to get more information about what countries have submitted, on the portal itself, you'll have something called NDC registry, where the countries are supposed to submit their country NDCs, and you can see all countries on it. And then there's the global stocktake, the numbers, the emission cuts, and all that. That's also available. So there are multiple reports. I could also send some to you following this, some of the material. Okay, application of NDCs is not mandatory if a state is not part of the Paris Agreement. Well, in which the case to follow by whom is the question. Because if it's an international agreement, then countries have to be willing to engage in it and commit to it, which was the case. And then there are options for you to get out of it, like US has put forward that step, and they would technically be out of it by 2020, end of this year, if I'm not mistaken. And I mean, what can the global community do if that's the question? If a country chooses not to be part of it, then there's not much the others can do, except for maybe having sanctions in countries saying if you're not part of the agreement and if you're not taking certain actions, your products cannot be sold. But then it depends on the country's power and the economic level also. So ideally, what would be expected is that the countries commit to this and keep to it, and there won't be problems in global commitments and voluntarily ambition. That's the expectation. What are the challenges? Well, we have actually done recently a few reports to identify the challenges, gaps, and needs, which is available on our website for a detailed one. So the general challenges that we've faced as a country is the capacity, technical knowledge and capacity of country actors to understand NDCs, implement NDCs, and then technology needs, research needs, and then evidence and information that's available to develop these NDCs to ensure that they're not going to threaten any sort of sector-based development. And then climate finance for implementation also, it's not just about developing a measure, but also implementing it. So climate finance is also one of the key things that the country needs. But I think still awareness on NDCs and capacity about these among the key stakeholders is also one of the prevalent gaps and challenges we are facing. Yeah, I think I just answered this. So you can check the UNFCCC website if you need a general overview, but I could also share a few material. And you could check on our website, SLYCANTrust.org. There's a knowledge portal that has a lot of material on it also. Right. So I start from the last part of this question, whether the general public understands it. I'm not entirely sure because NDCs is very technical in terms of as a process. So things titled NDCs, I think the awareness among the general public is quite low. But people do understand climate action. So it's if you're talking about climate action, need for ambition, higher activity in terms of addressing climate impacts, I think the general public has increased awareness than it used to be the case before. Second part, how significant is it to get the involvement of civil society and general public? It's extremely important. That's where the multi-stakeholder, participatory, inclusive process comes to play a role, because if it's just a government-driven process, it could become one that is not going to take into consideration all these cross-sectoral elements, resilience, vulnerable groups, interests, and needs. So it's important that civil society, non-governmental organizations, think tanks, universities, youth, women, all these groups are like part and parcel of the process itself. Some countries are doing this better than others. I wouldn't say Sri Lanka is bad at it. I think Sri Lanka has been quite engaging in terms of the process of getting civil society involved, but it's not perfect. So when you say civil society is involved, it doesn't mean everyone across the country is involved. It could be at national level, certain groups and representatives who are within the processes could be representing the civil society perspective. But ideally, it would be good to have local level consultations, bring it to a national level discussion as well. And coming into entry points, since they're part of entry points also, simultaneously, we have processes like localized indicator development for SDGs that's happening. And that also has a consultative process where different actors come on board for that. So if these are together and the sectors are identified, the indicators and all priorities, then these could feed into the NDC process as well. And we can have a much participatory and inclusive process. No, that's it's not a tribunal kind of process. We have the Paris Compliance Committee, but it's to facilitate compliance. This is a big issue when we were drafting the Paris Agreement, because a lot of countries were worried that it would be like the Kyoto Protocol, and then it would be too stringent in enforcement, and that people would just leave the process if it was going to be something which is going to be penalty based. So the penalties are not there. The whole purpose of Paris Agreement was to keep people in and get them to engage and perform, and it was all about facilitation. It's actually a problem also, but this is the case. Yeah, we could go. Ludo, all countries agree. Well, in statements, yes. So all countries do agree to work towards finance flows, but during the negotiations we have every year, the COPs, we decide to which level. So how much money is to be allocated, who's going to give this, and then the processes of common but differentiated responsibilities come in, because you have some developing countries that do also have the capacity, but then the binding finance obligations come to the developed countries. So climate finance is a tricky one. This always takes a lot of back and forths in the negotiations. And in principle, the idea is, yes, we need climate finance, and that we need to have efficient way to target and take it to the ground level and communities that are vulnerable. Okay. Good question. I don't want to answer this wrong. But the thing is, under the Paris Agreement, the obligations are at country level. So if it does not come within a country radius, then it doesn't come under that country's obligation. But we do have marital transport-based emissions, and then different groups working on this. So there are collective discussions around it, but I have not seen how this reflects in the NDCs. So just like the transboundary elements, and then I forget the entity, but I could actually find this is a new discussion. So oceans are part of the new discussion phase. We have ecosystems of oceans taken into consideration since the Blue COP, which was 2000. Yeah, in 2000. So it's 2018 Blue COP, which was led by Fiji. So the discussions are on, and then maritime emissions, that's also there as a track. ICAO is also part of this discussion around aviation and maritime and all those things that come in. So there's a report that comes out, but I'm not entirely sure who's dealing with this at the country level. So I have to check on this before I answer. So if you're in India, I believe it is it? The person who asked the question? Yes. Okay. So the thing is, the Readiness Action Plan, that's IN's Readiness Action Plan was done by Sri Lanka. So I'm not sure whether India has one of these. Ideally, having this at sectoral level or national level would be great. So Sri Lanka developed this 3-year plan just after the Paris Agreement was signed, which stretched for 3 years between 2016 and 2020. And it helped the countries to identify which departments deals with what under the commitments we've made. So, for example, if we had, having better feed for animals in the farm animal sector, then who would be in charge of doing these would be listed. So identifying which feed is best would be for a science-based entity. Finding would be another one, and then supply would be another one. So things like that, there was a breakdown as to who does what for departments at government level. So this was mainly for the government actors so that they know what they are asked to do. And then there were certain links where the private sector could engage, CSOs could engage as well. So I'm not aware whether there's a readiness plan that is for India. It will be good to check with if there's one. And then having an idea of how micro level it could get based on the governance system. But if another opportunity actually which you could look into is the national adaptation plans and the provincial adaptation plans process. So since most of you are here with the interest of understanding how it relates to farm animals, wildlife, biodiversity, just to get an idea, because these will fall under also food security, for example. These will fall under adaptation sectors. And the National Adaptation Plan would be one of the main ones you could look into to take action on climate change. And then, for example, Nepal has had local adaptation plans. They call them LAPAs. So this has been there for a while now. That could be a good example to look into. And then provincial adaptation plans are being done in Sri Lanka. So that's also a sub-national level one. These could be taken as examples on how the macro level actions could go to micro level in terms of implementation and what kind of governance system we need to have for climate action. What if country submitted, but not working in the sense that the country's submission is not working or the country is not working towards implementing it? So I'll answer assuming both. If a country submitted NDCs but not working in that field. So that's the tricky part, I said. Like, so for example, if you've submitted the NDCs, it's a voluntary one. And the binding ones would be usually the monitoring, reporting, and then climate finance if it's developed countries. So there are certain elements in the Paris Agreement that are more binding, and the others are more towards persuading you to perform an action. So NDCs at country level, it would be the part of the stakeholders to persuade the country to take actions based on the NDCs that they've submitted internationally if they're not working and acting on it. But then also it's important, rather than pointing the finger and saying, okay, you're not doing this, trying to understand why it's not happening, identifying the gaps and trying to help to address them. So SLYCAN and Human Society in Sri Lanka, we've been working with the government to ensure that the technical needs and capacities needed or the support needed is provided from our end, and we work together to ensure that the NDCs are implemented. So for example, we've had some of the consultations on certain sectors that we want to prioritize on with the government to identify what the gaps that are there, and then identifying whether the NDCs that were submitted were not realistic and not possible for implementation, which could be a reason why they cannot be implemented also. Because in 2015, the process of submitting INDC became something people didn't know what it was, but they had to do it. So they did something most of the time. And some of them submitted 2 pages, while some had researched evidence-based submissions. So I think these 2016, 2020, the years would be an opportunity for civil society and technical experts to engage with the government. And this could be an entry point for the other actors to engage actively with the government to do the work. And it's a matter of how you do the advocacy. In Sri Lanka, we work with the advocacy action of working with the government. So any action we do, we pick on the NDCs that are prioritized, see what needs to be improved, bring in some experts who would know about the topic so that what we say is taken as important and worthwhile, and then support in ensuring that ambitious NDCs and reviewed NDCs are there. Okay, I think this is the same thing, same question, isn't it? I answered that with reading the question. Okay. What are the loopholes in this initiative? Okay, that's a question I don't understand. What are the loopholes in the initiative of having NDCs? That's actually a very long discussion if it's a global NDC process. Are you looking at NDC implementation at country level? But then I don't see the word loophole being one of the good words to use in it. Are you looking at gaps and constraints? I'm a bit confused. Sorry. If you're looking in terms of gaps and challenges, like I mentioned before, I think at country level, a lot of developing countries, Sri Lanka included, especially least developed countries, they do not have a lot of information data to have actions designed to match the scenarios, and some countries don't have country level scenarios, climate scenarios, and then there's a lot of climate finance needed if we actually want to have effective actions implemented, and then technical expertise. But the thing is, there's also cooperation and entities outside that help in these processes. For example, SLYCAN Trust, we work in Africa, helping out countries like Uganda, Tanzania, and a few more actually in Asia and Africa on developing certain elements that link to prioritizing their sectors and also identifying what would be the best way to have entry points. And then similarly, other country level actors could also contribute to the country NDC processes to ensure that there are cooperative efforts to ensure that the NDCs are more participatory plus evidence-based and reflecting the realities. For climate finance gaps, there's always the possibility to apply to different mechanisms like the Green Climate Fund, JEF, Adaptation Fund. NDC partnership is set up with multiple actors like World Bank, UN entities working towards helping countries to implement these. Yeah, so there are a lot of things that come as answer to your question because I'm not very specific to sure which area that you were really focusing on in this. Okay, next one, if you don't mind. Scientific basis. Well, so climate finance, as I mentioned, we have to have proposals at the moment that are sent to different entities, multi-level, multilateral or bilateral entities. And then we pick usually the priority areas. So if you see the projects that are ongoing, you would see projects on transport that have had certain bilateral funding. Then there's food security, water resources, and smallholder farmers as a focus for Green Climate Fund. So any of these applications that you put to a multilateral donor, you would have to have science-based reasoning as to why you need this support. So GCF is particularly very stringent in the application process. And this is seen as, by not just Sri Lanka, but many countries, as difficult for countries without a lot of technical capacity to apply and get funding when in need at the time they need it. So there are certain elements like readiness funding for national authorities to be capacity built. That's about $3 million given for that purpose. And then there's NAP readiness funding, which is another $3 million that a country could access to get funding to be ready to implement a NAP. So that's under GCF. And then there are also thematic-based projects that are there for finance accessibility that's available. Are there any countries that are? Well, it's very subjective, I guess. Some countries could have very ambitious targets. For example, least developed countries on some elements have very ambitious targets, which they seem to have performed, but then it depends on the country, the size of the country. And then there are other countries that have, I guess, I don't know. Dennis, you want to add on this? I think Europe has some ambitious targets that have been put forward. Germany is seen as a country that's doing more than other countries in providing climate finance through different mechanisms. For example, climate insurance global partnership was set up to provide funding to support least developed countries and other developing countries in their vulnerability reduction. And that could come under a process of obligations under the Paris Agreement because the developed countries have the obligation to support climate, through the finance process and technical processes. But as an example, I say Bhutan might be a good country to look at in the forestry targets because they have 0, I think, in the emission levels now. They've balanced it out. And then there's Costa Rica that has very ambitious targets. Yes, it's a question how you say they are successful, I guess, because if it's Sri Lanka, how would you measure whether they're successful? That's the question. I mean, I could say they're successful by going by what we would have been 5 years ago and then what we are achieving now through maybe participatory part of it or inclusivity or how we design these elements. But then for another person, it could be not successful. So we don't have like, this is the success level of a country to say this is how you determine success. But there are certain exceptions where some countries have been very gender responsive in their NDCs. So that could be a success. I'm sorry, Suram, I think we need to have a chat on this later because it becomes a spectrum of successes on how we say this is successful. I'm guessing this is Surama Pereira. Okay. Is that all? Have I answered everything? Yes, I think so. Okay, so if anyone else does not have a question, I would just like to kind of add a bit on this aspect of how we can connect food security, sustainable consumption and production, biodiversity and wildlife protection, what else? Disasters, and how maybe animals and humans could be in disasters, and these things could connect to NDCs because so Suramya is working on meat reduction work in Sri Lanka. And in our work on this topic, we would connect to sectors like, we connect to outside processors which link to NDCs, for example, Sustainable Development Goals, where there's an ongoing process on indicator development, localized indicators developed for the Sustainable Development Goals, where we can identify certain ones that are related to the activities. And then forestry, because livestock and deforestation have proven elements that have interconnectedness. So how can these work together, and how forestry targets could reflect livestock's meat reduction targets also. And then biodiversity and wildlife, these are under many NDCs in many countries, and then they can connect with tourism also. How ecotourism could protect biodiversity and wildlife rather than exploit and misuse the resources. So these are things that we take into consideration when we develop our actions, our project activities and advocacy activities, so that they connect with the NDCs. In Sri Lanka, we have 14 sectors, 5 mitigation, 9 adaptation, and then there's loss and damage and means of implementation. So all these have multiple level commitments, and how these can be integrated to the processes that are already there, so that activities could be more inclusive, different partners could engage, is something we would like to look into. Dennis, if you could add a bit on how the research you did on forestry and livestock and that topic and how it connects with NDCs, I think it might be helpful for those who join from India because they work on this topic.
Sure. Everybody can hear me. Hello, everybody. I'm Dennis from SLYCAN Trust. So we are doing research and have been doing research on livestock and sustainable development, sustainable consumption and production, and also NDCs. And the livestock sector is relevant to NDCs in a number of ways. One way, obviously, would be emissions from the livestock sector, which are quite high. All the livestock emissions combined are greater than the whole of transport, the whole transport sector emissions. And the 20 biggest meat and dairy producers alone emit more than the entire country of Germany, which is quite mentioned. But on the other hand, there's like a rural livestock sector also that can be looked at as a way of creating resilience, but it has to be looked at very carefully, and also if there are possibilities to phase out the small-scale livestock production as well. And just transition, of course, is a quite important factor in looking at how NDCs can reduce livestock sector emissions and reduce livestock production, and especially industrial livestock production. Sri Lanka has in its NDCs identified livestock as part of food security and adaptation, and I don't think it's under the mitigation sectors. Vositha, correct me if I'm wrong.
It's not under mitigation.
No. Because I think most of the livestock emissions are coming from developed country industrial livestock production. And livestock, of course, also creating emissions through feed production and associated deforestation and the degradation and destruction of ecosystems. So it's one of the, in Sri Lanka, it's one of the major drivers of deforestation, especially in the northeastern part. So that is something that should be, I think, maybe included in the next draft of the Ndc's.
I hope that kind of gave you an idea of how things could connect in terms of different sectors and Ndc's. Would this typing something? If you have a question, please type. I thought someone was typing. Okay, so there's no question, and we're out of time also. I think I will stop now and also announce that we would have another session happening next week. That would be about sustainable development goals and the process for developing localized indicators. I'm not sure whether HSI team members are involved in these processes and how in India this is happening, but in Sri Lanka we have the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals Act, which provides for developing indicators which are localized for implementation of the SDG indicators which are global. So this has had a consultative process in the past, in the last year or so, and we've engaged, human society in Sri Lanka has engaged also. And we looked into how certain priorities of climate change, sustainable development in different sectors we work, and how gender responsiveness, ethical aspects of animal treatment could be brought into the discussion. So next week we'll have our senior consultant, Dr. Subodha, who will speak on this, who's also working as a consultant for developing the localized indicators. And he'll be able to give you an idea of how things are happening and what gaps were faced in developing it. So if you have any questions, if you'd like to engage, you're more than welcome to join us. I'll circulate, or Thatcher will circulate the information next week on this.